Good afternoon, and welcome to today's program. My name is Matt Abbott. I'm the Director of Government and Diplomatic Programs at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. I would like to extend a special thank you to Northwestern University for partnering with us on this event. We're especially grateful for all of the hard work of Rachel Beatty-Riedel, the Director of the Program of African Studies at Northwestern. The Council is an independent and nonpartisan platform, and we remind you that the views expressed by speakers and panelists are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. This event is on the record and is being live streamed. Before we begin, please make sure to silence your phones. Following this afternoon's presentation, we will welcome audience questions. Our live stream viewers may submit questions by typing chi.cnf.io into their web browser. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Isabella Alexander is a writer, filmmaker, teacher, and anthropologist. She currently serves as a visiting assistant professor at Emory University. Hannah Armstrong has worked in Africa as a writer and researcher for various publications and organizations since 2006. She currently serves as a consulting analyst for the International Crisis Group. John Campbell served as a U.S. Department of State Foreign Service officer from 1975 to 2007, including as U.S. Ambassador to Nigeria from 2004 to 2007. He currently serves as the Ralph Bunche Senior Fellow for Africa Policy Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. And our moderator, Zekeria Ahmed Salem, is an associate professor of political science at Northwestern University. His distinguished career also includes serving as the director of the Institute for the Study of Islamic Thought in Africa and on the executive committee of the Program of African Studies. Now please join me in welcoming our speakers.
All right, thank you, Matthew. It's my pleasure to be moderating this discussion, and I think without further ado, I will ask the first question. What is happening in the Sahel and the Sahara? Anna Armstrong.
Well, I mean, you have really a lot of things. It's an incredibly dynamic region that's attracting a lot of attention at the moment. You have the conflict in Mali, which is multi-layered and involves many different actors and many different dynamics. Overall, insecurity is really sort of spreading throughout the region. The current conflict can be said to have begun in around 2011. In 2012, conflict in northern Mali was the major concern. Since then, it's spread into central Mali. It's spread also into Burkina Faso. And there's a sense that structural factors are creating a very weak, vulnerable environment that poses a security concern to neighboring countries and possibly to Europe. In other ways, the countries in the region are remarkably resilient, experiencing economic growth, and there are positive narratives that we don't hear as much about in the media.
All right, thank you. Ambassador Campbell.
I think what really interests me about the Sahel is the remarkable degree of continuity. What are its challenges? Let's start with poverty. It's one of the poorest regions in the world. In northern Nigeria, about half of all children are stunted. I suspect the percentage is higher in Niger or Chad. So poverty. Secondly, pretty rapacious governments, which are, to a certain extent, varies from country to country, are alienated from their populations, and their populations want to have as little to do with them as they possibly can, because essentially what governments are an instrument of exploitation, as opposed to the provider of services in the sense that we think of governments. A tendency towards millenarian religious expression. Boko Haram, of course, is the one that is probably best known now. What's the goal? the goal of Boko Haram, but also of its predecessors, is the creation of God's kingdom on earth through justice for the poor by strict enforcement of Islamic law or Sharia. Now, notice that formula of words. There's nothing in that formula that says anything about politics or economics. And in fact, Boko Haram doesn't have a 10-point program for the revitalization of the economy of northeastern Nigeria or the Sahel. That's not what it's about. It's rather about a different kind of reality, which is one reason why it's very hard for us to get a handle on it. But it's equally hard for the secular governments in places like Abuja to get a handle on it. So religious millenarianism. Security. Security in the Sahel is a hot topic in Washington, also in Paris. Makes me very nervous because our understanding of the drivers of events in the Sahel is pretty superficial. I don't mean necessarily amongst academics, but academics are not making policy. Knowledge of the Sahel is superficial amongst policymakers in Washington, also London, a bit less so in Paris. And it's superficial amongst the various UN agencies based in New York. And that situation has actually gotten worse over the past 2 years with the departure from federal agencies of a significant part of the expertise that was once there and could take and translate what academics were doing into forms that policymakers could use.
Absolutely. I want to give Isabella Alexander the opportunity to give their own appraisal on the situation on the ground, given your interest in immigration and people's flows from the Sahara to the Mediterranean.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the great thing about this panel that's been brought together today is the different angles that each of us have into looking at the region. And so building on what the other panelists said about both economic and also political insecurity in the region, there are certainly increasing flows of people fleeing. This region has long been a crossroads of exchange, and what I'm particularly interested in exploring is how the current policies of the EU and the UN, primarily in North African countries, so in Libya and Algeria and Morocco, have influenced the flows of people towards the Mediterranean, sometimes pushing them back to their countries of origin, and sometimes leaving them in these sort of liminal zones across North Africa.
So that was, my second question, I guess, is what are the root causes of what is unfolding there? And are these mainly political? Are they related to climate change? Are they related to collapse of states? And what are the root causes of what is unfolding now? And there is any kind of nuance according to countries or region or zone or border you can think of? Hannah?
I mean, the way I see the region, you have incredibly young countries that are struggling with the constraints of colonial modes of administration that are completely ill-adapted to the realities that they face. The countries are young both in terms of how long they've been independent countries and in terms of their populations. I think you have, as we've seen with the Arab Spring, which the Sahel has to some extent been implicated in, Burkina Faso in particular, there's a strong desire to sort of uproot, antiquated structures and replace them with something younger and more reflective of the current reality. And I think the story around migration is very related to that. There's a sense that if we can just create, countries at home that we can have a vision for and that we can see ourselves reflected in, people from the region would vastly prefer that than to having to, flee or run away from these areas where there's conflict or things just don't move in any sort of direction. So I think the tendency to primarily define the Sahel in terms of conflict or struggle is eclipsing other realities, which are essentially constructive and sort of optimistic.
Ambassador Campbell, about the root causes of some of these conflicts and how they are related to each other. How immigration is fueled by international interventions, and how climate change impacts.
Yeah, I would start with two relatively recent phenomena. The first is the population explosion throughout the region, most clearly seen probably in Nigeria, which now has 205 million people. And the expectation is that by 2050, there will be 450 million people in Nigeria. And at that point, the country will displace the United States as the third largest in the world by population. Now, that's a population boom amongst people. It's also a population boom amongst cattle. And that's really very, very important because there is a fair amount of conflict between herders and farmers, exacerbated by the tremendous growth in population and also the increase in the size of cattle herds. Climate change. Sahara is moving south. There are a variety of different estimates as to how rapidly it's moving. I've been going to Nigeria since 1988, and I myself, with my own eyes, have actually seen the Sahara moving south. That is to say, areas that in 1988 were pasture now are essentially desert. But at the same time, you have a rise in sea levels in the Gulf of Guinea, probably the highest in the world. The increase in sea levels is probably the highest in the world. Lagos, which is the sort of metropole for West Africa, has 22.5 million people, and it's at sea level. So you have population boom, climate change, relatively new, and yet they run almost like yeast through dough when we're talking about the Sahel.
And I want to add something, Isabella.
So I appreciate how your question pulls in not only economic and political insecurity, but climate change as well, which of course is increasingly one of the complicating factors. I think when we zoom in on the individual level, most of the individuals that I work with who are leaving home can't tell you one particular driver. It's almost always a complication of factors. There's more than one thing. Even if it's someone who's fleeing active conflict, there are also economic issues that led to their displacement. I really appreciate Hannah's point, too, about the counter-narratives and the importance of us highlighting the stories that aren't as often heard, because while from the outside we might be able to define a region as a region in crisis or a particular movement of people as a crisis, on the inside experiencing that, people rarely define their own lives as in crisis. They experience all the highs and lows that we do, and you see that if you stay long enough with one group or in one region.
Which calls the question whether we are, from the Western perspective, are we seeing these countries as pathological, in a pathological way, which makes it even worse to be able to identify the challenges? Or is there any role for international perception, including among policymakers in the West, in worsening the situation on the ground? More precisely, is the military intervention has anything to do with the ways in which things are worsening on the ground in terms of security, of relationship between ethnicities? Because we've witnessed 2 weeks ago that some ethnic group were attacking other local ethnic group in central Mali, for example, and this has not been happening before the international forces were on the ground. This kind of civil war, rampant civil war, has not been happening on this, under this forum. So what do you make of that? Is this a new development? Is this, whose responsibility is this? Hannah?
I think we're witnessing the militarization of the region, starting with Mali, and the G5 is a good example, which is based in Mauritania, but wants
the G5?
To be active. Well, the G5 is both the Force Conjointe, the joint forces.
5 countries.
Of Mali, Mauritania, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Chad.
And funded heavily by France.
Funded and backed heavily by France. And so far, there's a lot of skepticism about what it can contribute to the region. But it's in terms of security. It's not really clear. They've attracted a lot of funding, but in terms of what they specifically can contribute in terms of stabilization or securing borders, there's a great deal of doubt, and it remains really unclear. What I think the G5 is part of is an ongoing process of militarization. And I think you're very right to bring up this massacre that has just happened in Ogosagou, which was absolutely horrific and on a scale of violence that Mali hasn't really experienced before. And the picture that it paints is communities are increasingly relying on militias, and militias are realizing that you have self-defense groups, you have militias. They're occupying a political role. Sometimes they have, there's a sense that the provision of security has completely broken down on the side of the state, and people are turning to alternative forms of protection, which are beginning to get into really heated contests with one another. So it's an extremely problematic dynamic. It's one that we're seeing spread. There were some militias in northern Mali. Now there are more militias that involve different ethnic groups in central Mali. There are some parallels between central Mali and Burkina Faso, where the state security forces are increasingly restricted to smaller and smaller areas. And this process of militarization, on the one hand, is being driven by external actors who are coming in and trying to provide security, but sometimes creating other problems. And the increasing perception of insecurity by communities, which is leading them to arm themselves and form self-defense groups. So I think what really needs to happen is the region needs to sort of think outside of this military solutions to political problems motto, which seems to be deployed since the crisis in Mali, and think much more about how they can use dialogue and political solutions to start to demilitarize the region.
Mr. Campbell, what's the role of the international community in the shape that the security situation is taking in Northern Mali?
I couldn't agree more with your basic points. I think arguably the French intervention in Mali was not successful and probably made things worse. I am deeply concerned about militarization of the Sahel, not necessarily by the Sahelians, but by us. The notion that these various jihadist groups that operate in the Sahel are somehow or another a threat to the United States, to which we should respond militarily. And the way normally suggested is through some kind of security relationship with the security forces in the country that's involved. Boy, do we ever have to be careful. I mean, the security forces that operate in the Sahel very often are riddled with human rights violations. The biggest single driver of recruitment for Boko Haram, by far the bloodiest of the jihadist movements, is human rights violations by the Nigerian army and the police. And insofar as we become associated with that, we're going to pay a price for a very long time.
Isabella, we know that one of the reasons why part of this region has been securitized or militarized. At some point, it was under the pretext or the pretense to control immigration flows. What is the state in terms of immigration monitoring and repression, I would say, and how does that affect human rights on the ground, on the immigration routes?
Yeah, so we're seeing the borders of Europe not only being pushed into North Africa, but increasingly further south along some of the primary migratory routes, one of those going directly through Mali. So it's not only the presence of international community being the UN, particularly the IOM, that's present in that space, but also...
What is the IOM? Please remind our audience.
Yeah, so when thinking about the UN's role in controlling migration flows, we can think about the UNHCR, which is primarily dealing with those who've been categorized as refugees or asylum seekers, and the IOM, which is primarily dealing with what they would categorize as economic migrants, but also sometimes including asylum seekers who have not yet been able to get refugee status. So the majority of the work being done in that region is by the UN's IOM, or their International Organization for Migration. So that also is pulling in smuggling rings that are often transnational groups that are taking advantage of the fact that there are large numbers of people flowing not only north, but north and south along these routes, also in return migrations. You can imagine from the outside looking and seeing that there's a large population of majority young men who are seeking an escape, sometimes very frustrated by repeated attempts at crossing the Mediterranean, repeated detentions, experiences of detention in North Africa, and seeing that as a resource for, as you said, conscription into militias, into local military groups, and training camps that can be really, really dangerous.
So whenever you read about this region, the kind of analysis you came across is a description of the so-called perfect storm of immigration, poverty, state near collapse or collapse, jihadism, terrorism, international intervention. So what is the reality of that on the ground? Is this something kind of fabricated situation? How do populations on the ground perceive or see their own perception as a threat to international security and maybe to their own security? Hannah.
I mean, the situation on the ground is very different. You have some communities who are living in insecurity and who are vulnerable in areas that militias are active in, or government forces in some cases. But I think for most of the inhabitants of the Sahel, the projects and the occupations and the things that you think about in your daily life are completely removed from these ideas that we have. The Sahel is being sort of packaged and manufactured as this crisis area, but it's a very different reality. So if you take countries like Mauritania and Niger, where you haven't had the insecurity has been very contained. There's a very young population, kind of thinking about how to build companies, how to pursue relevant types of education, how to get married, how to have children. These are things that we can all relate to, and they're quite, that's what most people are sort of consumed with.
What about trafficking? We hear trafficking. You hear entrepreneurship on the ground?
What's that?
What you hear entrepreneurship as opposed to what we call in the West trafficking?
Well, you have both. You have both.
Okay.
And
Can you explain a little bit?
There's a very long tradition of informal trans-Saharan trade networks, of course, that this great exhibit at the Block Museum does a good job of looking at. And in terms of trans-Saharan trade, there are categories now of what's considered trafficking that is, well, to not get into too academic of a discussion about it. You have informal trade and you have formal trade, and a lot of these regions where there's very few formal opportunities for trade and economic growth, you have a reliance on informal economies. To some extent, in some places, this can be associated with conflict and with risk. In Mali, drug trafficking is a type of illicit trade that is very closely connected with the conflict in that country. In Niger, you have examples of informal trade and illicit economies that are not associated with conflict and that have been sort of managed in such a way as to to democratize economic opportunities, to politically integrate former rebels who might otherwise rely on violence. So there's a very, it illustrates a type of resilience and entrepreneurship on the part of communities to sort of, trade, which in the end is what people in the Sahara have been doing for thousands of years, bringing goods and people from one side of the desert to the other.
I wanted to ask Ambassador Campbell about American presence on the ground. What are we talking about here? Are the American troops on the ground? Is there any presence of American forces? Are United States really monitoring the situation on the ground? Are they going to be involved?
It's extremely small, and in fact, it's getting smaller. There is only one U.S. military base in all of sub-Saharan Africa, and that's in Djibouti, and that technically is actually a French base. We are talking all together in sub-Saharan Africa, perhaps 300 to 400 people, most of whom are involved in various training operations. And as I say, that number is being cut with the current administration's refocusing on great power rivalries as opposed to terrorism. So it's small, and it's going to get smaller. And it has, in my view, no measurable impact whatsoever. And for that reason, and because I am very concerned about American identification with corrupt regimes, I welcome it, that it's getting smaller.
Okay. How about other foreign presence, Chinese, Asians, other powers in the region?
Well,
do you have any information about?
The French have a significant military presence and the political will to intervene from time to time, most recently as they did in Chad. There is some Chinese military presence, not very big, mostly involving support of various peacekeeping operations that they are part of. Now, they are building bases. They're building a naval base, so to speak, just up the road from ours in Djibouti. So there is a Chinese military presence, but again, it's small.
Isabella, you did most of your research and filming following the immigration route. Do you have any insight on the impact of immigrants once they arrive in Europe, on Africa, or this region in particular, in terms of remittances or exchanges of ideas or information, how that shapes the situation on the ground? Do you have any insight on that?
Yeah, so the three particular journeys that I've been filming most recently were from the DRC, Sierra Leone, and Mali, traveling often back and forth many times until getting to eventual final destinations, whether those were in Europe and North Africa or back sometimes in their countries of origin. It's one of the stories that travels back more commonly, the success story, right? So one of the things that we're particularly excited about with this project, I'm working with the IOM to bring not only the film, but these sort of what we call counter narratives into the communities, giving the migrants themselves the chance to go back to their communities and to talk about their migratory experience. So for reasons that you can probably imagine, the stories that are full of more hardship and struggle are the ones that are less likely to travel back home. Like I said, it's a population of mostly young men. Oftentimes their family networks or sometimes even their entire community has pooled together resources to support their journey. And they often don't want to talk about the fact that they lost all of the money to smuggling rings, that they spent long periods of time in detention, that they were beaten or raped, which are all common occurrences along these migratory routes. What they do want to send home are the success stories. And so more often, the stories that end up making it back to the communities of origin, to the families, to the friends, are the stories from that really small percent, about 8% of them who will make it and be able to rebuild lives. So it gives people in the communities a really unbalanced idea of what the reality of that migratory route is like in this present time and space. And so those stories, the success stories, but also the stories that more honestly discuss the struggles, are important to come back, in part because there's so much money being dispensed along that migratory route and often for nothing. So the average amount that a migrant or asylum seeker, because they're taking the same routes regardless of their political categorization, will spend is about 3,000 euros right now, which is an enormous amount of money in these communities. That's not even to mention the money that's being spent by the international community, by the UNHCR and the IOM in securing borders, in detaining and in repatriating people. That averages closer to 30,000 per individual if we break down all of the money that's put into detention centers and border control. So I think those are stories that are important for us to bring back to the community, because there's so much money being inefficiently spent that could, as I think you were noting, go into development, economic development, which is obviously one of the primary drivers. And as Hannah mentioned, most people would prefer to stay home if they had economically sustainable options to be there in their home communities.
There has been no shortage of formula or plans to revive, to stabilize the Sahel, especially in the recent times. What is on the table now? Ambassador Campbell, you work in Washington.
You mean
what kind of
what's on the table?
Everybody knows now that the formula, the cooperation between local government and foreign nations is not working. That's obvious now, despite of the big spending on the Nexus security development there.
If you're talking,
so what is going wrong there?
Well, if you're talking about what the U.S. official approach to the Sahel is, it's largely unchanged from what it was under the Obama administration, despite White House rhetoric to the contrary. And that is because Congress has insisted that levels of funding for USAID and other programs, PEPFAR, for example, that funding levels be maintained or actually increased. So there's very little change in what is actually going on. Now, nobody should ever think that Africa is very high on the list of priorities in Washington. It's not. It's near the bottom. So the fact that there is a good deal of continuity between the Obama and Trump administrations as to what is actually being done, this is actually positive. It could be much worse than it is.
How about the European Union that thinks of the Sahel as its backyard?
Well, it does think of the Sahel as its backyard, and therefore they are more immediately involved than Washington is. I have no particular knowledge of what the levels are of EU assistance in West Africa.
It's enormous. And there is a lot of money being spent in all kinds of studies and consultancies and non-effective work on the ground. And officials in the European Union would recognize and acknowledge that this is part of what they are doing is not working. Not everything, but part of what they are doing is not working. Now, in terms of opportunities, I know for a fact that many oil companies are investing in the region. And they are sometimes investing in Senegal, in Mauritania. There have been discoveries of oil. Is that a factor of peace, or that will increase the insecurity risk on the ground? Do you have any information about that? What is your analysis?
I think it depends on the stability of the state and the strength of the institutions. So in a country like Senegal, people are concerned in Senegal that oil, starting to extract oil and gas will actually destabilize the country. But I think that Senegal has a lot of momentum going and a lot of stability. And it's interesting to look at sort of Mauritania versus Senegal, how each country will be impacted by beginning to enter into resource extraction on that scale. So I think a lot depends on sort of the situation as it is already.
So are these economic resources potentially important to stabilize these countries, or not? Or they might be
if managed well, they can be. But what we've seen more often in the region is that they become sort of hot button issues of one more illustration of how the government is failing certain communities. So especially in North Africa, communities living around areas with oil and gas wells and sites have been really politicized. and have become sort of more prone to forms of political and social contestation because they see the wealth of the country and the wealth of the business elites coming from their regions, which are often quite remote. And the money goes to the capital, or it goes to foreign capitals, or it goes into the pockets of businessmen with shady relationships to the state. And the regions themselves remain among the most underdeveloped in the area. So for the centralized states, it's a real challenge. I think often the oil companies themselves would like to do more to work with communities because they recognize that without the buy-in of the people in the area where you're extracting, you have a higher risk. But sometimes the centralized government can be an obstacle to those forms of cooperation.
Do you want to add something on that, Ambassador Campbell? Or
it's not called the oil curse for nothing. In the case of Nigeria, oil became commercially viable in 1957, came to dominate the government's exchequer in the 1970s. Arguably, the country is now less developed than it was at the time of independence. At the time of independence, it was a major food exporter. Now it imports food. At the time of independence, it had a dynamic manufacturing sector. That's gone. Ghana. Again, the institutional weaknesses there have led to an upsurge in corruption associated with oil. I'm not particularly sanguine that any West African country has sufficient institutional infrastructure to cope with the stunning increase in wealth that oil can provide.
Okay.
So I would rank it as excuse me, a factor of instability rather than of stability.
Okay. One last question before we open it up for questions the audience and live stream. What are the opportunities to improve the situation and the economic development on the ground? What are the opportunities? What can we work on to improve them? And this is something that should come from local government and societies, or the West has a role to play there?
I think we need to. I think foreign partners need to start approaching the Sahel in a very different manner and in a very different light. What we're seeing is the EU, for instance, is now increasingly driven by this discourse about migration and curbing migration, and a lot of its humanitarian and cooperation projects are being hijacked by this project to stop the flow of migrants. And I think that's a real mistake. I'm seeing civil society activists being kind of corralled into working with migrants, and teachers being corralled into working with migrants. These countries need, civil society activists and teachers are a really important resource in these countries that can be, implicated in a project where you have a vision to build a country and to sort of move in a direction that doesn't just involve treating the youth of these countries like a security risk for Europe. We need to sort of think about the potential of these countries as opposed to the risk that they may pose. And I think that's the difference between the outside view of the Sahel and the inside view of the Sahel, where there's a much clearer sense of how much potential there is. There's a lot of creativity, there's a lot of youth, there's a lot of resilience. You have a lot of different cultures and ethnicities that are mixing together. Culturally, it's extremely rich. So I think, in terms of foreign partners, I think we need to stop this securitized approach and think about a more reciprocal way to approach the Sahel that doesn't, involve this security development nexus, which I think is kind of a challenge. And I think for Sahelian countries, we need to start seeing the translation of this energy that we see in the youth into some sort of political vision, that can start to sort of move into the state, because what we see is the same kind of corrupt cycles of dependency and there needs to be some sort of translation. Some connectivity is missing, and I think with time we can start to anticipate that.
Ambassador Campbell, do you have something, a last word on that?
I think, I'm talking.
What are the prospects of peace and security?
Right, I'm talking specifically about the United States and economic development in West Africa. And I tend to think that we're pretty marginal and are likely to remain so. What we could do that would be positive would be to encourage more bilateral trade. There are in place already the AGOA arrangements, for example, which are designed to do that. But I think I would hope that we could do more.
Isabella, do you want to add something? Where do you see the Sahel and the so-called immigration crisis in 10 years?
Right. So it's not a crisis is a good place to start, right, is thinking about the language that we use and also the tendency to look at the narratives in really polarizing ways. So either the country, if we think about the attention that was given to Mali, for instance, most recently in the really horrible ethnic attacks, the attention that was given to that region as being completely destabilized and the complete lack of attention that's given to attacks that are ongoing against Fulani people in Guinea and some degree in Sierra Leone right now. So the fact that there's very rarely a middle ground or a nuanced view of these spaces and how damaging that can be, and migration is seen through that same lens. So the fact that these individuals, young, motivated, looking for economic and educational opportunities, most of them wanting to come back and be able to invest in their home communities and be part of the new generation of political leadership, it is essential to have that exchange. And it's not all towards Europe. There's an enormous migration and movement and exchange of people within the continent between those countries, which is equally important. People going to places like Morocco or Senegal to further their education, most of them wanting to return home. So starting to think about migration and mobility in terms of the potential that itself offers the individuals and the communities.
Absolutely, and effort on the ground from the part of civil society, as Hannah said, and the youth are often overlooked and not taken into account when devising those public policies. Now I think we have 20 minutes left. I want to thank our panelists for insightful comments. And now I'll turn it to the audience in the live and in the audience here in the room. So I want to ask, please, the audience to wait for the microphone before asking their question because we're streaming live. So the first question in the audience. Richard? Okay.
So what impact do you see the ouster of al-Bashir having for the region?
Did you hear that?
Yeah.
Are we doing one on?
Yes,
okay.
please.
Well, I think it's very interesting. It's very linked to what's happening in Algeria. You have the population in Algeria and the population in Sudan are in this sort of dialogue where the protest movements and even the militaries are sort of paying attention to what's happening in each country. And no doubt the ouster of Bashir is linked to Bouteflika being sort of pushed out a couple of weeks ago. In terms of the region, Sudan is not a major player in the Sahel. It depends on how you define the region of the Sahel. It's very closely linked to Chad, but in terms of Mali and Niger, I think overall it sends the message that this kind of long-term authoritarian rule is not worth investing in for people who might be, inclined to go in that direction. Interestingly, in Mauritania and in Niger, you have in both countries, you have the president who's nearing the end of his second term and has been very explicit about the fact that he is stepping down and is preparing for, is absolutely not going to take a third term. In Ivory Coast, you have the president who's sort of flirting with the idea and trying to get people comfortable. But I think overall, the ouster of Bashir really sends a message, and with Bouteflika as well, that new forms of governance are needed, and there needs to be, the transition period is quite difficult, but yeah, it sends a message to authoritarians.
You want to talk?
I think we have to wait and see. I see parallels with Zimbabwe. where Mugabe was booted out, but the system continues. And there's been no particular improvement in Zimbabwe or even change in Zimbabwe. Sudan is much less developed than Algeria. And there is no equivalent in Sudan of the very large population in France of Algerian origin. So I think we have to wait and see whether, in fact, in Sudan there has been real change or not. The other thing, it will be interesting to see whether the popular demonstrations / rioting in Khartoum, overwhelmingly female in terms of personnel, whether that introduces a kind of dynamic that's going to go in a completely different direction from what we've seen before. So I think we just have to wait and see.
Okay, another question from the audience? Yeah, here and then Richard.
Well, why don't you go ahead first? And then... Yeah, all right. I just want to just say a word. John, so good to see you.
Good to see you.
Right. Well, you know, in all the years we've been dealing with these issues, I don't think there's a time when I have felt as perplexed as I am about the situation. We talked this morning about the crisis of the post-colonial state. John, you talk about, you know, the predatory state that we do have. Nigeria, you know, we have 20% of the population, and today we saw a graph showing it has about 40% of the conflicts. I think so. You can come up with ideas about saying, well, the youths, let's find some ways for the youths to engage. And so, I mean, it all sounds really nice, right? Mm-hmm. And Europe and the United States and others are really concerned with basically containment, securitization, and so on. The thing I would just leave is, if we know that there is this deep crisis of the state, then we have to find a way to get a conversation going about that. I'm not saying we're not going to do with all of this, but if in fact we really see this as, quite frankly, and I see this way as a primary driver, I just want to lay that with you, that we need to sort of address that.
And I have a question here online that ties up very well with that question. Are there any countries in the region whose government are a model of governance, or that could be emulated by weaker countries, or what are those countries? John Campbell?
Well,
what country are well governed?
If you take the Fund for Peace's Challenge State Index, the only African countries that rank highly on it are Mauritius, Seychelles, and Botswana. All three of them are very small. All three are not riven by sectarian or ethnic conflicts. And all three of them are wealthy. Now, if you're talking about governance in sub-Saharan Africa, clearly there's some states that are better governed than others. Mm-hmm. The one that I find particularly impressive is South Africa, where some 20 years after apartheid, you have in place a democratic government that has regular elections, the rule of law, and an independent judiciary, and probably the most extensive protection of human rights anywhere in the world. And it has 60 million people, so it's a big place. There are also interesting things going on in Ethiopia, also a very large state, which potentially are quite encouraging. Mm-hmm. The other big states, Congo-Kinshasa, Nigeria, you fall back on hope?
I mean, nobody in any of the countries of the Sahel will say that their government is a model of governance,
No,
and
right.
for very good reason. There are lots of problems. Without looking for a model, I think a useful yardstick is sort of how are they managing to adapt and evolve to the really difficult circumstances that they have to exist in. And I think that really comes down to decentralization. That's sort of like the technical way to try to adapt the structure of the state to the demands of governance. Niger, I think, has done decentralization pretty well, not flawlessly, and maybe, no doubt, in some regions better than others. Mali, I think, its mishandling of decentralization was definitely one of the factors of conflict. Maybe Niger had some advantages going into it that Mali didn't have. In terms of security sector reform, there's also, questions of adaptation and evolution that Mauritania has had some success with. Burkina has not. So, I think what it really comes down to is looking at, how each country is sort of responding to or is able to respond to the challenges that it faces, and the challenges are quite considerable.
I have questions about what can the public do to push the U.S. government to be more active in a constructive way in the Sahel. How can the public pressure the government of the United States to be more involved in addressing the issues in the Sahel?
Addressing the issues in the Sahel. The first principle has to be, first, do no harm. And American involvement in the Sahel is not by definition necessarily helpful and positive, because it's driven by too many different factors. So if you're talking about what can be done to encourage positive, thoughtful American engagement in the Sahel, then I think you're talking about doing things like identifying NGOs that are often doing spectacular work in the Sahel and providing them with financial support. Making it clear to Congress that the necessity to maintain current levels of funding for humanitarian relief. But this has to be fairly subtle. I mean, the last thing we want is an 800-pound American gorilla running through the Sahel and not having the vaguest notion what the consequences are of what it's doing.
Still 9 minutes. Next question from the audience here. Okay, lady here in the front. Wait for the mic, please.
Well, thank you all for your perspectives. Having been involved in the Sahelian region for 50 years, as living there and working there off and on, I've seen a lot of changes, but also no changes or reverting back to past practices. Currently, I'm involved with one of these NGOs that is doing a mighty job to educate women and girls and to bring them up to expect a better future, and giving them a vision for a future that they're participants in society. So just as my comment would be, I think entrepreneurial skills development and an increase in the private sector is the answer, because the government is never going to be able to employ all the young people who are currently being educated. So there'll be a constant frustration there and turmoil because of that. So I don't know if any of you have anything to add to that.
Is your organization particularly concerned with elementary education?
Elementary and high school.
Elementary and high school, because of course, it's well known that what brings about the greatest and fastest improvement in social statistics is when women are literate.
Great. I have a question for you, Isabella. How has the flow of immigrants into and out of the Sahel negatively or positively affected the region overall?
Yeah, so we were speaking about the different narratives that flow back, right? And the positive impact in these spaces has been the enormous flow of economic wealth, material wealth, remittances that are coming in that certainly can concretely impact that community, but also the skills that those individuals come back with. Just like you spoke to in your comment, the fact that people are coming back with the ability to not only the education, which they might have gotten at home in their home community, but were then frustrated that they couldn't access jobs there. They leave, right? They come back with the ability to create small-scale businesses at that level, which is so desperately needed in these communities. Businesses so that the other people who are there, who are getting sometimes quality educations and are unable to access work, have opportunities. I would say that's the primary positive impact that I see. The negative impact is the reverse of that, is the loss of so much talent, the loss of, as we mentioned earlier, about 3,000 euros per person. That's a lot of money flowing out of the region. And if you think about the fact that the individuals who often leave have been supported by their families or by their community, think about, as a family member or a community member, if you're going to pool all of your resources to send one person, who are you going to send? You're going to send the one who's most likely to succeed. So they're often losing the very best and the brightest of the community to these out migrations. I think the narrative we often hear is that these people don't want to return, right? Oh, they'll go to Europe and they'll find good jobs and they won't ever want to come back. In my experience on the individual level, that's simply not the case. Most people are there with the goal and the intention of returning to their families and to their communities, but increasingly they're not ever making it to their intended destination in the first place because so many are losing their lives on these increasingly treacherous migratory routes north.
Thank you. Next question.
Thank you all for being here today in a great discussion. Dr. Campbell, I have a question for you. If we look to certain nations that claim to be democratic across the African continent, for example, Ethiopia, I was on the ground when President Obama was there, almost celebrating their democracy, and the general feeling on the ground from the Ethiopian people, especially the young people, was that he was endorsing a non-functioning democracy, which we now know the TPLF was stepped down, and we have Abiy Ahmed out front in Ethiopia. So my question to you is what can the U.S. government do when we see a democracy that isn't really functioning like a democracy? And how do we curb some of the negative impacts of saying, yes, we're happy you're a democracy, without really hurting the U.S.'s reputation on the ground?
It's for Mr. Campbell.
Realistically, there's not much we can do. Whenever you're talking about sham democracies, there will be a variety of U.S. interests that are directly involved. And any administration has to try to balance those. And they do so. And there are plenty of sham democracies. Look at Zimbabwe. So it's difficult. It's really hard. And what do you do when you have a genuine democracy, South Africa, where the official relationship is not very good with Washington? Other types of relationships are excellent, but the official relationship is not particularly good. So you've got to balance. But I don't really think that there is much we can do realistically that will have an impact.
I have a question for you specifically, Dr. Campbell. How should the informed academics mobilize to better inform policy that influence peace in the Sahel?
How should
academics mobilize to help address the issues arising in the Sahel? And educate the public.
Yeah, if you're talking about educating the public, it's a case of finding a vocabulary which is accessible to the educated non-specialist. Again, I may get in trouble for saying this. If you look at the articles that appear in journals of political science, they are largely unreadable. And the trouble with that is the influence on the public is much less than it otherwise might be. People who are very good at this, British. British are extremely good at translating work that's done in academia into terms that the voting public can understand. We're not so good at it.
We'll have less than 3 minutes, but we have space for 2 quick questions. I have a number of questions here. About what are you most optimistic in the Sahel, Hannah? That's a question for you.
I sound very optimistic.
Yeah, yeah.
What am I most optimistic about? Well, what I can say is I've seen, one of the lady earlier was saying that, nothing has really changed in all this time. And on some level, yes, that's true. On another level, if you look at Niamey, it's unrecognizable from where it was 6 or 7 years ago, the capital of Niger. There's tremendous investments flowing in. There's huge construction sites everywhere. The people carry themselves differently. There's something about these societies that means that, things can turn around very quickly. And that makes me extremely optimistic to think that, once you start to get things a little bit right, and I'm not saying there aren't problems with governance in Niger or even humanitarian catastrophes, because there are. But if you just sort of look at, and maybe that's just the capital, but there's something that has really changed significantly there, and that's related to, a kind of reinvigoration of the population, a form of governance that's more accountable and more visionary. And when you kind of think about how quickly things can start to take off, I find that very exciting. When you, in part because these countries are so young, things can move much more fast than they can in America or in Europe. So, Asia is an interesting paradigm in thinking about what could happen to Africa in terms of development. And yeah, I find that very exciting.
Any other reason for hope in terms of security and peace in the region? Or better ways to address the challenges on the ground?
I fall back on the formula of first do no harm. And ultimately, there will be an improvement in the security situation in the Sahel because of what the Sahelians do, as opposed to what outsiders do.
Rachel, have a question? A last question? 30 seconds.
So we've been talking about, the impact of the securitization of borders in terms of thinking about kind of in accessing Europe. And I'm wondering how can we think about borders productively in terms of internal migration, which is so much about what we think for the Saharan connectivity and the productive value of economic migration from one country to another. How can we be thinking about border policy productively among contiguous countries?
I think our time is almost up. So
Well,
if you have a question,
there is
answer.
ECOWAS, which allows for the free movement of people across borders. I guess my fundamental point would be that the borders don't mean very much. They're lines drawn on a map by Europeans that are essentially very largely illogical. One factoid that I quite enjoy is that there are 3 border crossings in Borno with Cameroon, 3 official border crossings. There are at least 350 informal border crossings in which there's no monitoring at all because the border doesn't mean anything.
With that, please join me in thanking our panelists for a wonderful discussion.
And thank you. Yeah, thank you.